Buddy, basketball is here. Real basketball, at least regular season basketball, Nets basketball. Hit us with the beats.
My friend, it is the start of the Brooklyn Nets NBA season, taking on the defending championship Milwaukee Bucks. 5 big questions that we have going into this first game of the season, questions we need to see the Nets answer so we can feel like that championship energy is brewing on the road.
We're going to cover all the things that we're looking for heading into this first game against the Bucks. We go step by step, kind of previewing this game, then a little bit for the Nets season ahead. Got a packed podcast. Really excited about this one. Thanks for making Locked On Nets your first listen of the day. We're going to get into it all, but first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast and the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day, starting the regular season. First game is upon us. I'm Doug Norrie, owner-operator, DFSR.com. If you need some basketball projections for FanDuel DraftKings, head on over to DFSR.com. And that is Adam Armbrecht. You can give him a follow at Adam Armbrecht on Twitter. He's also the host of the One Giant podcast. So that season's over. Fully able to focus on the basketball season ahead of us. Thanks for making Locked On Nets your first listen of the day. You can also check out all the other great offerings on the Locked On Podcast Network. And we are here now to talk about the Brooklyn Nets season starting. It's finally here. Long off season that was felt like it's full of stories. And now we're about to see some actual real wins and losses game action.
You're gosh darn right, my friend. Yeah, I haven't told my co-host on the Giants podcast that it's over, but he'll find out when I stop showing up for the recording sessions. That's how true blue I am. This is good though, man, because even we talked about it in the last episode. We're a couple days away, but now we are previewing the Bucks matchup with the Brooklyn Nets. We're asking the questions that we're going to get answers to in the first game of the season here, or at least, some sample size to understand what we're looking at as we embark on this 82 game adventure of watching the Brooklyn Nets. So man, it feels like forever, by the way. It's been a heck of an offseason, like you said, a lot of storylines. We didn't lack for content, and also like basketball. Basketball is why I like to watch and cover the Brooklyn Nets. And so I'm glad that we're finally back to that place now.
Oh, dude, we're going to go through the 5 questions we want to have answered here as we go into this Bucks game. If you want a sort of a bird's eye view on the whole season, 1,000-foot view, go back and check out our previous podcast with Kane Pittman from Locked On Bucks that went up late last week. We cover sort of like the moves that each team made to sort of combat each other this year, the budding rivalry, all that other stuff. Today, we're going to focus a little bit more on what we want to see just from this first game, going 7:30 on Tuesday evening on the East Coast. Have to suffer. Oh, never mind. That's one of the questions later. I'll tell you that one later. Let's go through the first question. So first question we had that Adam and I kind of were thinking about were, who are the Nets starters? And on the one hand, this feels easy. And on the other hand, I'm not sure the preseason gave us a ton of clarity around what the Nets plan is for the course of the season around starters after some obvious ones.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to burst anyone's bubble. Kevin Durant, probably going to be in the starting lineup. Might want to pen him in, use permanent ink.
I heard he got the first string jersey in practice. Yeah, they gave him.
They all got circle up, everybody. We are going to reward Kevin Durant with the first string jersey, along with James Harden as well. But the interesting thing is, because we're going to touch on them kind of individually as we work through these questions, they're locked in. We kind of have that high bar expectation for them. The problem is, or not even the problem, the curiosity becomes who fills out the other 3 spots in the starting lineup. And then even beyond that, what does it mean once you plug in 3? Well, where does everybody else flesh out in terms of the overall rotations here? And you mentioned over the last couple of preseason games, we got we'll call it traditional sample size, where Blake Griffin, the usual suspects were in that starting lineup. But in the final tune-up before the regular season kicked off, in a dose of humility around one Nicholas Claxton and some other guys, we got a totally different look than maybe we anticipated.
Yeah, so it was interesting because obviously Kevin Durant's going to start, James Harden's going to start. I think we're going to call Joe Harris like a locked-in starter. I think that one's
Yeah,
fair
yeah.
too. I don't think those three guys are going to change at all. I do think over the course of the season, starting with this Bucks game, we're going to see a lot of movement around this 4th and 5th spot in the order, and I think that's just the nature of the way that they've created a team. Now, if you look at that first preseason game, they did start Blake Griffin and Bruce Brown, much along the way that they had been sort of filling out the starting lineup to end last season. That did not happen with this last preseason game against the Timberwolves, where Bruce Brown was active, barely played 11 minutes off the bench. And they actually started Nick Claxton, making my take on him completely irrelevant less than 48 hours after I said it. And then, and Paul Millsap as well. Aldridge was available, played more minutes than either of those two guys. Blake did not play, coach's decision to sit out that game. So I'm not sure after that, like that one really threw me for a loop because it would have been one thing if both Bruce Brown and Blake were not active, except that Bruce Brown
Mhm.
was active and barely played. You know what I mean? It's almost like, but then they could restart and do the same thing this game. And I don't think that would be the worst idea in the world either. It's like, it is a little bit of a weird spot. Of course, we'll have clarity on this sooner than later, but it more speaks to some of the uncertainty around what probably Steve Nash and company think are their best 5-man lineup, at least to start the season. Cause I don't think that that's a solved science right now.
The shame that I carry around just losing my faith in Nicholas Claxton. It's something that I'll never be able to get away from. I have to carry that burden with me. Now all I can do is listen. I'm sending the letters. I'm writing the emails to the man. Hopefully he forgives me. But you're right though. When you see no Bruce Brown, or very small minutes I should say for Bruce Brown, when you get these DNPs, coaches decisions for a guy like Blake, well that's where you back yourself up a little bit and say, okay, so there's obviously a minute share here that we can't factor in. But, we talked about the difference from last season to this season as far as already having the roster together coming into this year, as opposed to adding pieces in along the way at the trade deadline, the buyout market, etc. But the one thing that maybe Steve Nash and this coaching staff still will need to figure out is which players complement each other the best, right? What are the best combinations now of these new players that we have? And I'm sure they've learned it along the way of training camp, but we talk about 4 preseason games, a little stint out in San Diego. There's not going to be enough there to have definitive, concrete choices about what you want to do. So I do think that I wonder if we'll get, starting with this Bucks game, a starting lineup that gives us a sample size. And then based on returns over the first few games of the year, maybe Nash starts to make a little tweak or make some small adjustments. But unfortunately, it's probably going to be on a game to game basis and saying, prove me right when I start you. And that buys you a little more before everyone settles into some definitive roles.
And I think if I were to guess right now without a clear, and I don't believe, I'm correct me if I'm wrong, I do not believe that they have released a definitive starting lineup. Steve Nash has also said they were going to experiment with things over the course of the year. I still think it'll be Bruce Brown and Blake Griffin here. I just think that that's what they're going to do.
But ceremoniously, right? Members of the team from
Yeah,
last
I just
season
think that
deserving of that honor, so to
sure.
speak.
Yes. Right. I think that's going to be the case. And actually does lead us to our second question, because it has to do with these rotations. And that has to do with how Steve Nash plans to stagger Durant and Harden this year. Like with no Kyrie Irving, with Kyrie clearly not going to at least start the season, and for the foreseeable future, there's been no movement on that front. So, or that we know of, so that he's not, and he's clearly not going to be with them till at least the beginning of the season. Is what they do with Kevin Durant and James Harden's minutes. Now that they know that they're kind of the two superstars, in the past, we saw that at times, especially when James Harden first came to the team, that they were actually very incentivized to keep them together. They played them a lot together and then just had off minutes with another crew, just because I think at that point it was like, well, ultimately the most important thing is for you guys to be able to play together, and we'll deal with some, external problems on offense when neither of you are in there. But to start, it's important that you guys play together. Again, they play together in OKC, but the this year I don't think they're really afforded that possibility, and it will be. And we saw in the preseason there was a clear line. There was Harden running units, and then there was Kevin Durant sort of led units. It was not. They definitely overlapped, but there was a clear sort of dividing line. This would be the number one thing I'm looking for in terms of rotations is, one, how these guys are staggered, and two, what the actual lineups that they use with each guy, because their skill sets when they're by themselves are so different.
Well, that's the interesting part of it to me is, I mean, obviously you talk about their talents individually and you can say you'll be the leader of this unit, leader of that unit. And I think sometimes going back to last year, right? James Harden really leaning into that role as a facilitator. You forget that Kevin Durant is more than capable of that and the attention that he draws from the defense. So you can see the similar ability to dictate tempo and pace from unit to unit. But what I do wonder is, do you think it's kind of a sub question I'll pose to you? Is it a good thing to set it up in a way that James Harden, maybe for stretches, becomes the primary scorer? Like, do you want to start to set up a potential where Harden is looking to attack and create for himself first, as opposed to be in the position where he's looking to set other people up, set up Kevin Durant primarily, and then work off of that? Because I do just wonder, it's like, what's the best version of these teams? And it's not diminishing what Harden can do, but you and I talked about like when Harden's out in space, can he just be a catch and shoot 3-pointer when everyone's focusing on Durant? You go, maybe he's not. Like, and it's not, it's just he has to be on the ball, dribbling. Like, how much of a Kyrie type role does Harden take over and build into now when you don't have a Kyrie on this team to be able to be flexible and shift some of those minutes around?
Yeah, we've seen kind of different versions of him, right? Like we saw, and I'm just going to use even preseason games, we saw against the Timberwolves where he just wasn't interested in shooting at all, or at least it wasn't available. He took 7 total shots. That was like eighth, no, sorry, sixth on the team or something like that. It's an incredibly low usage rate for him. Now he had a ton of he piled on the assists because they had that kind of game working. That roll and dive stuff with the big man. He's able to penetrate and find mostly these like little slip passes and stuff that he can do around the rim is where he's really, really gifted. I think that I would like to see him probably take more shots than he had taken in that last game. He did a few more in Philadelphia. I think it is important for him to be a facilitator, but you really keep the defense honest when you are in your bag scoring too, which he's as good in the league at doing as also, right? Getting to the line, getting into the interior, doing the stuff where he isolates bad defenders on the outside and is able to do the step back three, stuff like that. We saw it at times, but I'm all for seeing that a ton. Like that's what they brought him in for. They brought him. He showed the resurgence as a facilitator, and he's an absolute A plus plus, one of the best in the game at just seeing the court and passing. He's one of the smartest players that there is in the game when it comes to that. But he's also got this other thing that he's also unbelievable at, and I do think at times there has been not as much willingness to do that because he's got good shooters around him, and you don't need to kind of carry it on, but I think there's going to be stretches this season, and I hope we do see some of it here against Milwaukee where he does do some of the things that I know people started hating James Harden for when he was in Houston, which was long ISO possessions, right? Like ripping into fouls, stuff like that. That's still a core piece of his game.
I got to follow up to that as far as where this goes from here with some of the players that are on this roster around them. We'll get into that and also into the additions in the offseason, how it's changed, we think, the mentality of this roster and what they're capable of and what we'll look for in this Milwaukee game. But first, I got to tell everybody, you don't need to let the stresses of daily life weigh down on your body. Whether you're an elite athlete like myself or Doug Norrie, or just someone trying to make it through the day like a Kevin Durant or a James Harden, you can do that tension-free, and Theragun can help. Theragun is a handheld percussive therapy device that releases your deepest muscle tension using the scientifically calibrated combo of depth, speed, and power, and it's quiet as an electric toothbrush. The Gen 4 Theragun doesn't just feel good, it also gets to the source of the pain by releasing tension using Theragun's signature percussive therapy, which goes 60% deeper than vibration alone. The OELD screen and design make you feel like you're holding something from the future, my friends. Just go to their site and check it out. And the Theragun app learns from your behaviors and suggests guided routines for you as you continue to use it. You can try Theragun for 30 days starting at only $199. Go to therabody.com/lockedon right now to get your Gen 4 Theragun today. That's therabody.com/lockedon. therabody.com/locked on. So I said that I wanted to, you talk about Harden and what maybe you want to see him do a little bit more of. And I think it's different, right? You talked about his time in Houston where people get a little fed up with it. But again, when you're the only guy there doing that every game ad nauseum to a point, yeah, I could get that wearing a little bit thin. But when you're on a roster that's Kevin Durant and some of these other pieces, you go, well, you can take things over for a while if you'd like. And I do look into this before we get to our next question. I do look into this backcourt and say, even with the absence of Kyrie Irving, when you brought in some of these other pieces like a Patty Mills, even a Javon Carter, getting Bruce Brown into those minute shares too, I do think you can start to shift some of the responsibility. We talked about Bruce Brown being a very versatile player of, hey, get me off ball a little bit. Get me into my spot and then let me go to work. Let me do some ISO possessions if need be, but you can balance it a little bit differently where it doesn't necessarily have to look the same way as James Harden grabs the defensive rebound, brings it up the court, looks off everybody else, goes into his ISO mode, and then you get the results you get. I think there can be a different type of approach to that still gets you the same results of putting Harden in good matchups and letting him go to work. Quickly, the foul piece I think is really important too. Like him attacking at the basket and drawing those fouls early in games this year and against a team like the Bucks on Tuesday night. That's going to be important to setting a tone and giving your team opportunities, other players to get the occasional foul and get some free looks at the stripe.
Yeah, because like if you just look at his last 59 minutes of the preseason, he got to the line 4 total times. Like he
Not
took 4
enough. Not
total
good
foul
enough.
shots, and that's way lower than expectation on him per minute. Right now, there were some rule changes this year specifically to deal with some stuff that he does and like Trae Young stuff and like this like sort of stopping and starting in the lane and all this other stuff. I think that's maybe part of it, but not really. Maybe it's just a lack of aggression in total because it's preseason and why get hurt, banging on the interior when you don't really need to. But I will that we should keep an eye on this for this game, right? We should keep, and actually let's go to the next question because it actually has to deal with this. It's the next question we had, number 3 is, are the Nets now a more physical team this year? Going into the season, are they a more physical team? Not that they had lack of total physicality last year, but definitely on the interior, Nets fans have been pining for, and I think correctly at sometimes, is bodies that kind of can bang underneath, right? They can withstand the rigors of big guys in the lane, the Joel Embiids of the world, the Giannis's that we're going to see tomorrow on Tuesday that are really, really physical. Do you think that we're going to see in this game against a very tough opponent that is a big, strong team, right? Like, yeah, they have some finesse to them, but this is a bully. These guys can be bullies too, even without PJ Tucker. Do you think we see a more physical Nets team than we've seen in years past now with all, with the additions they made in the offseason?
Well, you certainly hope so because LMA comes back, Millsap, even throw Johnson into that mix. You throw Nicholas Claxton, whatever his role is going to be. The bigger bodies on this team, they've increased the number of guys they have. And even when you just saw like Johnson on the floor along with Claxton, you could tell, oh, well, Johnson has just a little more beef on him. And same thing with Millsap, right? It's just a little more muscle mass to them. So, and you throw Blake Griffin in there as well. I didn't mention him. That means you can rotate different people onto, even if you're going to be playing undersized at the 5 against Giannis. Okay, but you can throw a few different bodies at them. You can balance out how many fouls you take out, across the course of a game, which also means Blake and LMA and Millsap can be more physical because, okay, pick up 2 or 3 fouls over 3 quarters on them a piece. Everyone can take their licks at getting up against Giannis and trying to prevent some of what they do. Underneath this umbrella of physicality too, though, I do look at a player like Chris Middleton and say, no one looks at him and goes, he's a physical beast. You got to watch out for him, charging through the lane. But we do remember the matchup from the playoffs last year where Joe Harris was basically just getting, picked out of a crowd and said, yep, switch to him. Let's beat him up. Let's brutalize him. Bringing in this extra depth from a big standpoint should also afford the Nets to create better matchups and matchups where one of these 4 players that I just mentioned, well, you can take your turns on a guy like Chris Middleton and be a bigger, more physical presence against him. The wear down effect that you hope for over the first 3+ quarters, that's tangible now. You weren't going to get that in the best case scenario last season, no matter who it was. DeAndre Jordan couldn't stick with anybody on a switch. Joe Harris, grossly undersized. Nicholas Claxton, not big or physical enough, right? So they better be. If the Nets aren't a more physical team, then I don't think by whatever percentage, then they haven't addressed the concern that you're going to need when you face the Bucks tonight. And then when you face the other top teams in the East, right? We had the conversation around a very fun game in the preseason against the 76ers, right? Your biggest opponents, the biggest matchups need you to be able to be physical in. The Nets need to start answering that question really out of the gate this season.
Yeah, they had one guy basically that could do this around the wings, and that was Jeff Green last year. And they really felt his absence when he was hurt in the playoffs because they needed his 3-point shooting and they needed his ability to guard a bunch of different positions and be a pretty athletic, pretty big guy, pretty big, strong guy, which is what Jeff Green was. He was a big, strong wing, and those guys are really important. They did not get anybody this year that is a Jeff Green clone, and so what they did get, like you said, was lots of guys that do lots of different things that that are going to work in different matchups, right? Like Jeff Green could kind of work in any matchup, and that was like why it was nice to have him. He can be your sort of fourth best player on the court.
Mhm.
They got a bunch of guys like that in the sense that some are a little stronger than Jeff Green, some shoot a little bit better from three, some are a little bit better in the interior on the post, some are going to size up a little bit more on defense, but none of them are exact one-to-one comps for him. And so
Mhm.
I think we're going to see that picking and choosing of who they need to be physical. But you are correct in what you say. In each one of those guys they did bring in do bring more of a physical presence, right? Like there is a strength around this group that it does seem like they did not have in the past. They just simply couldn't swap in a guy like James Johnson. Like they didn't have a James Johnson that they could bring in to bang a body for 14 minutes, right? Like
Yeah.
to actually be competent at it, right? Like they didn't have a
And by
guy
the
like Paul
way,
Millsap who could like who was as smart and could stretch the floor a little bit. I mean, Jeff Green could kind of, he's still a little bit bigger and has a little more girth than Green too. So they kind of just brought it, and none of these guys have the finesse that Aldridge has, right? Like they don't like everyone was a little different, so that's why they brought in. It's like they just threw a bunch of stuff at the wall and say one of these things is going to work depending on the matchup.
right, and the question becomes, you mentioned Jeff Green. So, okay, Jeff Green could do 3 or 4 different things for us at a 65, 70 grade. Instead, we've brought in 4 or 5 different players across the spectrum of our roster, and we're hoping that for small spurts, they can do it at 75 or 80 for us, right? Or they can win a couple of these matchups a little more often, or at the very least, eliminate. And we saw this with Jeff, right? An older player, veteran player, starts to break down, has some little nagging injuries. And that's, I think, as much as anything, is what the Nets tried to address as well. Let's be deep enough so that we can keep everybody healthy throughout the course of the season and not burn out a Blake Griffin, right? Not burn out
Yeah.
a Jeff Green or whoever it's going to be. Not even, I mentioned at the top of this question, Joe Harris, be like, yeah, maybe we just don't have Joe do these things defensively that we'd rather him not. Let's get enough bodies so that we can pick and choose our matchups and hopefully be a deep enough team that you kind of win that war of attrition in a lot of ways. And is that an odd characteristic to throw into a championship caliber team? Maybe, but I think there were things to take away from last year, things to learn, and the Nets tried to make these tweaks so they made themselves a little bit stronger.
Yeah, and I think that's what Nets fans for years. What we've heard where they need to have a true power forward. This is what
Yeah.
this is the thing that people say, right? We need to have this, like, but what they're really saying is this thing, right? Is this physicality piece? It's not that anyone strictly wants the straight old school power forward type as
Right.
much as they just want people that are not going to get bullied underneath. The people, we don't want to lose the offensive glass that we've been losing for years. We want to be able to box out more effectively. Like, and you can do that when your body's bigger. Like these are the little things that Nets fans and we all see that have been little bits of problems over the last couple of years. Addressing them is you address them mostly through physicality, right?
Yeah.
Like that's just not a way that they were able to address it in the past. We'll get to our last two questions for we're going to look for in the Nets opening game against the Bucks. First, got to talk to you about our friends over at Bet Online. Head on over to Bet Online right now. Make yourself feel good when you look and you see that the odds-on favorite on Bet Online to win the NBA championship is the Brooklyn Nets. No Kyrie Irving to start the year. It's okay. We're still at the very top of implied odds at Bet Online. Bet Online has everything you could want and more when it comes to your betting action. Their number one spot for basketball and football action this whole season. You can head on over to Bet Online. See the updated desktop. They made a lot of improvements over there. It looks great. Or the mobile website. You can sign up today. You can do that for free, but you're going to want to make a deposit. And when you do, make sure you use the promo code Locked On, just like our podcast network. You can grab a 50% welcome bonus. It's got to be your first deposit, though, and you got to use that promo code Locked On. Football, basketball, baseball postseason going on, NHL back on the ice, boxing, UFC. It's all there for you, plus Vegas casino games. You can take advantage of all the amazing offers. Bet Online is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports. Bet Online, where the game starts.
And on top of that, we have to remind you about our good friends over at Rock Auto. I recently had a TPS monitoring light come on my dashboard. Listen, I'm not gonna lie to you, friends. We've told you before. I'm not a car guy. I use a car. I have a car and I like when the car works. So I went over to rockauto.com, typed in the part, and all it meant was that I needed to go ahead and get myself a little new piece of electrical something or other doodad. Best part was I looked in the manual, cross-referenced on the website. I did that job. I didn't have to go to the store down the street, have them walk into the back, pull out a part, and then charge me more. Why would I spend 30, 50, or even 100 times more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership that I could just go online and do myself? You can do it yourself as well. I know you have a laptop or even a cell phone. You can hop on their website where Rock Auto has been a family business serving the do-it-yourselfers like us for over 20 years. Rock Auto's prices are also always reliably low for every single customer. They have everything you could need from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpeting for that sweet cherry whip of yours. You can go ahead and explore the easy-to-use website today and find the solution to all your auto parts needs. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck and write Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the car parts you'll ever need. rockauto.com.
All right, heading into this first game of the season. Again, I just got to reiterate, well, two things. One, thanks for making Locked On Nets your first listen of the day. We're going to be with you every single day during the season,
I like
pre-games,
it.
post-games, midweek, after the week, whatever. Figure out all the times of the day,
All the
all the
thing.
days of the week. We're going to be here the whole time. So thanks for making Locked On Nets your first listen. As we get into this fourth question, I know how to count. I'm a
You got
numbers
there.
guy. Yeah, no, look, I know numbers. I did 1, 2, 3, now 4. As we get into the fourth one, this is a problem during the preseason. How could the Nets overcome the sloppiness that we saw in the preseason? This was not a
Sloppiness.
Adam. By the way, Adam and I said the word sloppy in the Adam Sandler like way, or Chris Farley, or whichever it was from Billy
Billy
Madison
Madison,
about.
yeah.
Well, we had like a 5-minute pre-show meeting, and 3.5 minutes of it were just us saying the word sloppy over over and over again. All right, so how can the Nets overcome the preseason sloppiness that we saw? Like, this was not a crisp preseason. This was not a team that looked together. They were not on a string for a lot of the time. There was a ton of turnovers. There was a general, I wouldn't even call it a malaise. It was just not great to watch at times. Yes, they beat the Timberwolves. There was lots of times where offensive sets broke down and they just turned the ball over. Do you think that's something we see carry over into this game? Like, do you think that is that going to be just a byproduct of the preseason, or is that like a product of this is a group of guys that just has not really played a lot of basketball together? This is not a group that's familiar with itself yet.
Yeah, well, so in some ways, when we talked about at the top around who's going to be the starters, we know what Kevin Durant's going to do. We know what Harden's going to do. And listen, it wasn't just James Harden, but we said knocking off the rust early in the preseason. It's almost easy to forget because it happened at the end of the year, happened in the playoffs, that Harden is coming back from an injury. So, the first question is he still trying to get himself back to neutral, back to, mid-season form? I think we anticipate Kevin Durant being in playoff form, being in Team USA form, but that's a big component of it. And sloppiness is a broad stroke label for how will the Nets overcome a lack of continuity is another way to phrase it, because like you said, new bodies, new players. Millsap held out for COVID reasons, the restrictions and guidelines for one game, DNP for Blake the last game. Sure, he was here last year, but basically we're saying you've got Patty Mills, LMA, and Millsap, three new big important pieces on this roster, let alone some guys like a rookie and Cam Thomas and what he may be brought along with. But you have these new players for training camp and 4 preseason games. That's what they've been doing, and the practices in between. So even though I think the Nets come into this year on a far better footing than they did last season, I also still look at it and say, could take a minute to get there. And when you look across the court in this game against the Bucks, you're talking about a team that basically brought it back. So, they're not going to have any of that roster continuity, maybe a hangover from the celebration of it all, but they're going to probably be in as mid-season form as possible. And I wonder if that impacts the Nets here, especially right out the gate on the road. First game of the season, would I be shocked if the Nets looked a little bit out of sync? No.
Yeah, this is a group. This is among the best defensive groups in basketball for sure. This at least the 4-man group, starting with Drew Holiday as a point of attack defender. He's about as good as it gets. Giannis is really one of the top 2 best defenders in all of basketball. Chris Middleton's an excellent defender. Brooke Lopez is an excellent defender. I guess they're going to start Grayson Allen because Dante DiVincenzo isn't back yet. But yeah, this is a group that will make you pay if your game is not really tight. Right. This is not the group that you want to be trying to figure out stuff against. They're super long. They're very physical. They're very strong. They're very smart and they're cohesive. They played a lot of minutes together. They played a lot of high level minutes together too. Like this is, they won the championship. Like it's as high level as you get. So if you're
higher,
ever heard of it? So if you're going to be sloppy against a team, this is not the one to do it against. So I think and then conversely, we just said, like, we have James Harden, we have Kevin Durant. Yes. But then just run down the list of guys that we just said that have played very limited amount of basketball with each other. Lots of minutes on record for them as players. But and Joe Harris too, like that, that was with the last group. Claxton even didn't play a ton last year, right? Like he was kind of used to spot, didn't play at all in the playoffs, basically. Paul Millsap's new to the team. LaMarcus Aldridge was barely here last year. Patty Mills was not on the team. Javon Carter, not on the team. DeAndre Bembry, not on the team, right? Cam Thomas, rookie. Like that's a lot of the team right there that we just went through the list on that has not really, outside of a few preseason games and some practices. This is just not a group that knows all of each other's ins and outs yet.
And we talked about this too, right? We know there's going to be a process here. Another question to add in there is just like, it's how important do Steve Nash and the Brooklyn Nets think this very first game of the season against the defending champion Milwaukee Bucks is? Because if they're really concerned about making the statement and winning the game, well then maybe you hedge away from overplaying some of the new bodies and you go with the tried and true, and you maybe try to make that statement about, hey, had we been healthy last year in those playoffs, this is what would have happened, right? With Blake and Bruce and Joe and KD and Harden. Boom. We'll give you a good lick. We're not even going to dive too deep into all of our new toys. Or do you look at it as 1 of 82 and we need to bring along all of our players and that's a part of our process? So there's a little bit of that to it too, right? The gamesmanship of it, and where's maybe KD's mind at about losing in the playoffs to this team. We know that a guy like him, a guy like Harden, they have an edge to them. So maybe there's just a little bit of like, hey, watch out, give me the ball and get out of my way. I want them to know that this was a fluke that was a fluke. This is where it starts for you. Your downfall begins now. That's a nice little, put that
well, that leads to,
pick that up in your pocket.
That leads to our final question, actually. The final question we had was, does the watching the Bucks? Well, the actual question is, will the Bucks ring ceremony impact the Nets? Like, do the Nets, having to see that this team won the championship, that they're going? I believe the plan is to raise the banner here, and give out the rings first game of the year. It's at home for the Bucks. I don't think the plan is to delay that. Is that going to be like sort of what you said? Is that going to be this? Yes, it's 1 of 82. But because it's 1, it's important for us to come out on the right foot, right? Like it's almost like 1 of 82 is a lot more important than 2 of 82. I think sometimes. I think in the past we've seen this impetus put on the first game of the year in a way that you maybe just don't see in the third game of the year. It's live television. It's the first game. There's probably a gentle prodding by the NBA that says, hey, everyone's watching this first game. We're not going to kind of like dial it back in this one, it back in other ones that are on yes later in the year. Like this is not the one to dial back. Right. And so I do think you combine that with watching this, I don't know, ring ceremony where if you're Kevin Durant, you might say to yourself, that should be my ring.
Well, like first off, yes, I think that it will it impact them? Yes. I think it'll impact Kevin Durant going, that's supposed to be my ring. We're supposed to be at home right now celebrating my championship. And I have no doubt that impacts him. The other big factor, so you said, 1 of 82, and the second game of the season is less important when you just want to make that big statement. Don't forget, you just did, I should say, credit to Doug for doing all the work on the win projections. When you look at the Eastern Conference and you talk about this being a very tight race, the number 1 seed should matter to all of these teams. This is a team that's going to be there, right? What's your win-loss record going to be against the Milwaukee Bucks at the end of the year when it could come down to that as far as where the seeding plays out? So in that regard, too, it's like this is as ratcheted up as you can possibly get for the first game of the season when you put 2 teams that Vegas thinks and everybody thinks are going to be there at the end of the year in the Eastern Conference. So from that regard, too, could the banner piece ramp it up a little bit? Maybe. But I expect that Kevin Durant leads that bullish mentality of we need this one. Like, it's like, it doesn't matter. The season is long, all that crap. You need to win this game for all of the things it does to start the season and what it could mean for you at the end of the year. We saw that play itself out with the 76ers and a game they could have won, all those pieces. So that's not out of their mind or not out of the coaching staff's mind. So I would expect that to have an impact for the Brooklyn Nets right out of the gates.
Yeah, I think we see this. I think we see him dialed all the way up here to start. I think that the ring ceremony probably motivates them. I think that there's so many other talking points that they'd like to be passed when it comes to just wanting to talk, just to play basketball. Like, the Kyrie Irving situation continues to be a situation that is not going away for the rest of the team, right? So, and so I think that there's got to be an impetus on coming out here looking really good in the first game and sort of putting some other stuff behind them. So I'm totally with you. So I'm excited for the first game of the year coming down the pike. We'll be back after the
+1 on
I think the Bucks. I think the Bucks win this one. Sorry,
Ooh.
I know no one's gonna want to hear that. I think the Bucks, just based on some of the issues that I think we saw, like with some of the preseason lack of cohesiveness. I don't think it's something that I'll ever worry about, but I just think that there's a few things working against. I would say almost any other team that they played against, I would not be worried about here, but a team that is pretty locked in around its core group and especially their starters, especially with some of the emotional stuff. I hate to say it, but I do think
Dominant Kevin Durant performance. Brooklyn Nets win, friends. Let me go ahead and sweep that ugly taste that Doug just put in your mouth. Brooklyn Nets
By the way, any podcast, probably person was like, dude, no matter who cares what you think, just say the Nets are going to win. That's all anybody wants to hear.
I was trying to tee you up there, Dougster. Trying to get you out there on a softball, but you went the other way. He goes
terrible at golf and terrible at using tees. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, we're going to get out of here. We're going to be back following the game. We'll podcast right after. You can check out this and every other one of our episodes up on YouTube. We're every single episode over the course of the year is going to go up on YouTube, plus more stuff. We'll do some live episodes as well. So make sure you are subscribed to the Locked On Nets YouTube channel. The link for the show will be in the show notes.
And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. That's Stefan Jobs.
Oh, one of the R.I.P. One of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball after a win over the Bucks.